So we know that, of course, the world of work has seemed to have changed, albeit unrecognisably in parts, over the last 18 months. But the one thing that we know hasn't changed is that organisations still need every employee to be performing at their best and contributing to the strategic direction. That's not new for performance management. That's certainly something that we know has been here for a long, long time. So what's been happening then? Well, we know that during the early phases of the pandemic, survival mode for most businesses meant actually to some degree, performance management was, I guess, off the hook, so to speak. Businesses were focused on the imminent challenge of just getting through the new way of working. And as such, it meant that performance management, I guess to many's delight in some respects, was on hold. And people were afforded, a bit of leeway to simply get on with their job and to get through the crisis as simply as they could. But organisations now are having to answer the question of how do we know if individuals are really performing successfully? And a question of trust, as been highlighted already in the chat, starts to come into play. Can we trust that people are really working from home, for example, is one question that has started to be asked more recently that wasn't necessarily asked maybe 6, 10, 12 months ago. So put simply, performance management hasn't had to answer the question of how it might need to change in order to support hybrid. However, we know that the pandemic continues and hybrid, as we've already said, remains a new constant for managers to handle. And so, of course, performance management can no longer continue to hide, and we need to find new ways for performance management to support this reality. Add to that, the task of managing people is, of course, complex, and doing so remotely is one that I think we could probably all agree very few of us, or managers indeed, are prepared for. And so it's easy to see how, as we think about this context, managers may be more susceptible to decision biases, strained relationships, perhaps misunderstandings in conversations around performance, where performance is, of course, now less visible. And so, in short, the future of performance review is suddenly in sharper focus. Companies are adopting new ways of working. Teams do have greater autonomy with less visibility around performance. And so trust is suddenly a critical underpinning for the performance management system. And nuances of managing people really do come into sharper focus. And what we've seen at LHH is that we're being asked, well, how do we reimagine our performance management process? And we will sort of round up with our conclusion on that question, because we do have a perspective to share around that. But I guess if we think about how performance management has reimagined itself over recent history, of course, even prior to the pandemic, companies have attempted to abandon traditional performance review models in favour of systems that are simply more dynamic, more innovative, and more agile. And several brands have been recognised with news-grabbing headlines of doing so. So we know examples like GE and Accenture, Microsoft, AstraZeneca have all been in the news one way or another for coming up with something that is less than traditional around performance management. And yet a closer look at these reveals that whilst they've moved away from a strictly traditional performance management approach, few have actually abandoned performance management altogether. And instead, we see that they've moved on a continuum of performance management innovation, perhaps towards some of these alternatives that you can see on the screen here, such as crowdsourced feedback, ongoing feedback and coaching, and even rating list reviews being on the more cutting edge of some of those approaches. So what we wanted to do is really get you thinking about, well, where are you already? Because it wouldn't surprise us if perhaps even prior to the pandemic, you had started to think about your performance management approach and start to maybe nudge towards something that is maybe cutting edge, if you're being really brave, or perhaps you're somewhere in between, perhaps you're trying new approaches, but in a process of transitioning away from traditional performance management. So we're going to get Iona to run a poll for us, just to get a pulse check on those that are online, where you currently are with your performance management system. So Iona, if you could open that poll for us, please, that would be great. Fantastic. Right, I'm going to share the results of that poll for us now. So we can see that, yeah, unsurprisingly, very few of us using cutting edge performance approaches, although very keen to perhaps hear from some of those that are using cutting edge approaches in just a moment. We'll find a way to hear more about those. But of course, you know, a real split between actually traditional performance management still being, you know, a stronghold for many organizations. And of course, then, you know, a good share of us, 50% almost, trying to transition, trying to do something a bit different, to reinvent, to reimagine that traditional approach. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for that. And as we go through, we will give you a chance to hear more about each of your different practices. I'm going to hand over to Jenny, because what we want to do is start to hear from each of your organisations around what do those different approaches look like for you. So for those of you that have said you're using a cutting edge performance approach, you'll be able to share in a breakout group more about that. And as we debrief that, we'd love you to be in the chat or be nominated to speak, so that we get to hear a bit more about what some of those novel approaches might be. Jenny, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Colette. So what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to put you in a breakout room. There's quite a lot of you, so hopefully this works. The one thing that we're doing breakout room is because we do believe that a lot of value, you know, from these top sessions is that actually learning from each other. So I'm really, really hoping that you're going to have quite a rich discussion on this. So what I'd like you to do is go into breakout room for 10 minutes. You'll be discussing, firstly, what is currently working or not working, your performance management approach, and then discuss how has hybrid working affected your performance management approach. Now, please pick a spokesperson or types person, because quite a lot of you, might not be able to get all of you to be on microphone to speak. So some of you might have to type, and just be prepared to share with a larger group. Yes, please do. Yes, please share with us, what's working for you, what's not working, and how has hybrid affected your performance management approach.
Okay, I'm going to also try and put a camera on so I can see you,
so
you don't think that I don't exist.
I'm
a real person.
I'm a real person, I exist in everything. So in terms of what's working and what's not, it's really funny. We're having some conversations about performance management, and it's always a struggle with financial services, because if you've got a pay for performance culture, and it's always been intrinsically linked in how you differentiate for pay purposes, it's really hard to think about how you might do something quite different and radical. So we as an organisation acknowledge that we need to do, we need to operate as we work in a very different way, in a very team-oriented way, and that we need to be able to do that in very sort of agile hybrid teams. So we know that. We're even doing it in a number of areas. The challenge that we've got is, how do you recognise that performance? How can you calibrate that performance, particularly if you're moving? So I'm in a agile pool that moves around based on SME experience. How can you understand the contribution compared to others? So we are going to come up to increasingly over time, as we build out these team aspects, is this inability to be able to say whether the contribution level is comparative if we don't start setting up at front what we want these teams, these roles, these things to be able to do. So it almost gets very, very important to get the measures up front. So in terms of what's working, I think, we are able right now to differentiate in terms of performance and therefore pay for that. I think increasingly that's going to be difficult as the organisation changes how it needs to operate. And because that's going to get more rather than less, that will be challenging. The other part is going to be, of course, that the markets as they are, you can't reward in the same way. So performance has to be much more about what you do for the job and how does that work. So we've got all those sorts of challenges, I guess, in there as a backdrop to work through. What is working well are some odd things that were sort of put in around opening up feedback. So allowing people to just go and request feedback as they complete a piece of work or finish. So that's obviously helpful. Doesn't help with calibration, but at least you get feedback. it's kind of well established. People know what they've got to do and how they've got to do it. Would we like it to be different? Yes, we would, over time. But I think we acknowledge the challenges that come with that. So what questions didn't I answer, Jenny? Now you've got me and you've got someone on camera and off mute.
I know, love it.
What can I do to help?
How has hybrid impacted these? So obviously what you talk about is actually in quite a general, before hybrid, those are the problems that existed, right?
Yep.
So how has hybrid impacted it? Did it make it easy? Did it make it harder?
So it's going to actually, if I think about it's going to amplify some of those issues. So we can't see people, they're not in the office, their contribution is even more what they achieve. And often when you're trying to innovate or do something different, you can't show that achievement because a lot of it is prep work, it's doing the connections that allow it to be more successful in the future. So actually it's amplified it. I've certainly heard people saying it's very difficult because I can't see people, I don't know. We're hearing from people that they're finding it hard because they're not able to show what they've been doing without it feeling like, hello, I'm over here, big light, let me tell you. So that's hitting them. So I think we've got an organizational challenge, we've got an individual challenge that's being acknowledged, and it's kind of being amplified from that hybrid piece. And I don't think it's as easy as, they're not in the office and they're not being seen. It's something much more subtle than that. I think what we have seen, though, it's been very good, is that global working has been a lot easier having been remote. So with that in mind, we've actually found it easier to get some things done. So performance oddly has improved in some areas, but it's very, very difficult to be able to say that because you just don't see people around the office. You're not seeing what they're doing. You're not sitting in big rooms. You're not able to give a perspective. From what you're
absolutely.
seeing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably the number one thing that we hear from clients. I can't see what my people are doing. How do I performance management? Then that is, absolutely, number one thing that we hear. What's interesting is performance has increased in terms of, the output, because either people are working more efficiently, that's one possibility, or the fact that we know some people, because there's no defined set hours of when you work anymore, and also because you're working from home, often people do work longer hours than they realize. By the time they finish the session, finish the day, they're like, well, hang on a minute, I've probably just done extra 2-3 hours because I didn't have to commute. So you would also find that as well as part of the reason. But there's definitely quite a lot of reasons that goes towards actually people are more productive in the hybrid environment. Was there anything that you would like to add?
No, I just thought it was really interesting hearing you speak, Beth, in terms of some of those sort of nuances around actually individual differences start to matter in terms of people being able to share the successes. I don't know if you were on the session, but I ran a session around women in leadership. And we talked, we talked about the challenge for women being able to shine a light on their successes where perhaps we feel awkward to do so. And what you've just described actually in terms of hybrid is sort of another layer on that, which makes it more difficult for successes to be visible unless you are prepared to articulate those successes and be able to articulate how you're adding value.
And I think also being able to articulate it in a way that's sort of, the thing that stands out to me is if you are building something new and you are doing something that will take time. So we talk about turning a tanker, right? If you're in a big organization, you can't do anything swiftly. You've got to try and move it and move through bureaucracy and move through very necessary controls. So with that in mind, often that ability to be able to show what you've achieved is actually, it's a portion, it's a move towards. So it's not actually a big, I've achieved it, we've got this done, hurrah. It's actually, we're making good steps, we are progressing, we're getting there. And that in itself is quite a difficult message to try and give across if you haven't got any of that collateral, that relationship is already built. So I think that's also the thing to be mindful of, and quite a big one to try and move over. So we've got friends come back.
I know, I'm bringing people back slowly, so be aware there'll be a lot more people in the session.
That's all right. I found lots of people that I know on here, so it's great. We've been chatting.
That's good. Well, that's
a quick time check if people are coming back. We've got half an hour for the remainder of the session.
Yes, perfect. One thing we'll like you to do is, if you already know each other, great. If you don't know each other, try and connect with each other, just because part of this session is about learning from each other, learning about what we do, but also actually just getting support from each other. And that's why we run these sessions, is to really making sure that you are supporting yourself, supporting each other. So super. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you. So I'm going to pick one group to just share what they discussed in the room. So at random, I think I'm going to go for room 2, and that's with Jenny Carpenter in that room. If you can share what the kind of things that you've discussed, and for the rest of the people, if you can share in chat the kind of things that you've been discussing, that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. That's a good name.
You're laughing. That's good.
Yeah, so in room 2, we were talking about what was working, and we were very much talking about the fact that while we were working remotely, there's very much a trust-based system going on. You know, it's not the opportunity to start looking at, you know, running reports on who's logging in at different times and all that kind of thing. That wasn't the where we were. You know, and it was very much focusing on the output, a bit like Colette was saying, focusing on the output, you know, rather than necessarily how many bums are on seats at certain points. And another big point that was made was around supporting the managers and upskilling them so that, you know, they have the wherewithal, because for some, they had experience of managing a remote team and some had absolutely no exposure at all. So again, trying to make sure that they don't sort of panic and fall over. Then with regards to what wasn't working, so despite some of the support that was provided, you know, lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We had some managers who perhaps dropped the ball a little bit, you know, perhaps provided an extra level of trust where maybe it wasn't prudent to do so. So if you had, if you had a member of staff who was relatively new, obviously you then need to hold their hand and support them a lot more, and some of the managers perhaps dropped the ball a little bit. So now we are perhaps working in a bit more of a in-person manner. There's a few more pips involved, and sort of those kind of discussions, and then thinking about the future, we were very much talking about having those regular touch points, so regular one-to-ones, rather than you just have your appraisal once a year. And also, you know, embracing the hybrid reality. So it's not going to be a case of everyone's going to be back in the office 5 days a week. You know, we need to, again, support the managers, support the staff, to make sure that they have the most effective way of working remotely, and the managers have that then trust behind, you know, they can do what we want them to do. And equally, you're going to have managers who are managing sites that are so far remote geographically from them. So again, there's those extra sort of issues that we as HR just need to be cognizant of, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you. And trust is something that we're going to be talking about in a bit. Yeah, you know, when you can't see people, how best can you manage them? You know, trust does come in at quite a big time. And actually, something you mentioned is about, you know, in a hybrid environment, a lot of times we're trying out what works, what doesn't work, in terms of, you know, do you need to be 2 days, 3 days? And actually being able to share things, you know, in kind of a very clear way, having trust in each other is quite important. Yeah, that's working, well, that's not working. Absolutely agree with you, Jenny. Was there anything else, Colette, on the chat?
Yeah, I was just looking, and there's some great ones that actually do speak to some of what we're going to come on to in terms of coaching style conversations, ongoing check-ins. But Rachel Hobcroft, I don't mean to pick on you, but you have been called out for sharing something quite inspiring and refreshing in terms of your progressive approach at BP. So I wonder if we could just hear a little bit more in the wider group from Rachel, if she doesn't mind taking herself off mute and sharing.
Sure. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Rachel.
Yeah, we were just talking about some of the changes that we're looking to make for our approach. So we're very much transitioning at the moment, but from next year we will have a new approach in place, which speaks to really what was on your slide a few slides ago around the kind of more regular connections, feedback, crowdsourced feedback. But one of the things we're really going to ask people to think about is like how to make that performance management piece like part of the way that you work, rather than just something that's an additional you know, an additional kind of piece that's kind of bolt on or a tick box exercise. It's like, how do you actually make it kind of live and breathe, and how do you kind of build in those regular connections, make discussing feedback not like a big deal, just make it part of, you know, those regular interactions. And when we were thinking about the hybrid piece, we already have kind of fairly global
virtual teams anyway, so that hasn't been necessarily a big barrier, but I think it is watching out for, as you say, those scenarios, those new managers or new hires, and how you basically just encourage people to have those connections and make those connections on an ongoing basis, that then I think kind of supports everything. But we are going rating lists, we are going you know, all of those and the feedback. I think the feedback is going to be the biggest kind of challenge, but it's yeah, it's going to be a journey.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And one of the things that's been called out in a number of the comments, Jenny, is something you've just touched on there at the end, Rachel, which is this simplification, making it an ongoing, everyday aspect rather than something that, as you say, feels that we're churning through it just because, and it's a bolt-on. So yeah.
A lot of managers, if you speak to them, the way they think about performance management is that it's a chore. You have to do it because you're required to do it, as opposed to I'm doing this because it actually helps the organization. So it's a definite shift in that mentality of actually how do we view performance management. It is one of the key areas. But the other point, I agree, you know, when we have new hires, when we have people, actually it's about thinking how best can we onboard them, right? Because normally when we do it face to face, that's probably easiest and quickest. But actually, if that wasn't an option, how can we best do that so that they felt supported as well? So yeah, that's definitely something that, you know, outside of performance management, that we look at as well. So great, that's really good discussion. And I guess that leads to my second question, which is about, you know, from your discussion in breakout room, are there anything else that's quite innovative that came out from, you know, dealing with the challenges COVID raised? Because what Rachel mentioned is definitely something that we've seen quite common in terms of, you know, organizations start to think about feeding forward, think about having more regular conversations, thinking about people's strength and how to really replicate the successes. So that's definitely what we've heard about. If you have heard of other things that you think actually that was quite innovative, you know, doesn't matter if that's something your company's doing or other companies doing, please do share in the chat. Or it could be, if you have a magic wand, you know, that's how you're going to push the boundaries. That can be it as well. So please do share your thoughts in the chat. One thing actually Jenny mentioned in the earlier share was that it's not about monitoring people, because one of the surprising things that we noticed is the number of people looking at online monitoring. Of course, that's not what we advocate, because no, that's not, we don't believe that's a long-term fix of an issue, but it's definitely something that we've seen, you know, mentioned. And if you think about technology innovation, that's definitely new. So we just wonder, has anyone come across that as well? Or any other innovation that we've seen?
I think Rachel's point was particularly innovative. I'd love to catch up with you maybe, Rachel, in a couple of months or 6 months from now to hear about your rating list reviews and how that's going. I feel like we need to watch this space, but it feels like it's a real cutting edge practice that, if you can get it right, could really, as you say, transform the way performance management is perceived in your business. But yeah, maybe too early to tell us.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I know a lot of companies, when they have taken out ratings in the past, have actually gone back to them. So we're kind of definitely conscious of that, but we're kind of taking a very deliberate approach at the moment, particularly I think because of the pandemic, and you know, just what everyone's been dealing with alongside kind of delivering for the business, to actually have a bit of a conscious break for a few years. So we took out ratings last year, we're not having them this year or next year, but we are going to be reassessing the value of ratings, performance ratings, to look at whether or not really what's missing by not having them, and what are the kind of any, you know, unintended consequences of that, and whether or not we can manage that in other ways. So so yeah, it's definitely going to continue to evolve, I'd say. But yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting, and I think the other really great thing that we're doing as well is really pulling that development piece in. So really making development a big part of it. It hasn't been so far. We've had a very reward-led process, whereas I think now we're swinging that pendulum back to the development piece too, which others may already be doing, but for us it's quite new to kind of bring that in more formally.
I feel like we may have paid you for a lovely segue.
I know, that's
to our point of view.
That's what I was going to say. So we're actually going to share, given that Rachel has done it so nicely to lead on to our point of view, so we're going to share with you how performance management needs to adapt to our new reality, really. So for us, you know, the purpose of performance management is about nurturing, it's about developing the person. So it's about person-centered, it's about empathetically driven, particularly, we've mentioned in
Jenny,
chat
do you want
already.
to just share the slides that?
Yeah, I will do, because when
Sorry.
I bring it up, yeah, no, don't worry.
Sorry.
So it will be about, being quite purposely focused on development, being quite purposely focused on the people that we are talking about. So it's really about having that positive impact on the organization. So how do we do that? That's what I'm going to show the slide there in a second. Let me just move along quite a few slides. So the first thing that we want to do is distinguish the purpose of the performance management conversation. And the two different purposes, one is more administrative, which is about pay, which is about promotion. And the second purpose is actually development. So the reason why we need to be quite clear about the purpose of the conversation is because when the performance is linked to pay, individuals are more likely to be open about areas they want to improve. And our research show that when using 360 for developmental purposes only, it actually produces much better gain in performance compared to when it was used for administrative purpose. Another reason to be quite clear about the purpose of the conversation is that traditional management, performance management tends to fail because employees perceive ratings to be unfair. And one of the most loathed rating is forced distribution, which is typically used for administrative purposes. And lastly, studies have actually shown managers using different cognitive processes to review employees, depending on whether it's for administrative purpose or whether it's for developmental purpose. And what we found is that, or what the research found is that we tend to rate people more strictly when it's for developmental purposes and more generously when it's for administrative purposes. So once we are clear about the purpose of performance conversation, then we can focus on what managers need to do to nurture individuals. And these are: be curious about personal drivers, collect insight, it's about strengths focused, and it's about coaching and feed forward. Now, we'll be talking about this one by one in a bit more detail, but for now, I'd like to draw your attention to the key element that underlies this whole process, which is actually trust and psychological safety, which we're already seeing in chat as well. So I'm glad that it resonates with people. Without trust and without psychological safety, your direct report, your people will not be sharing anything with you. As I mentioned earlier, let's imagine if I don't think my manager has my best interest in me or does not care about me, would I really be wanting to share, actually, I've got certain barriers that I'm facing, or I don't think I'm able to achieve certain goals because that's quite stretching for me. I actually need further development. So we really need people to have trust and psychological safety when we're talking about working in hybrid environment and when we're talking about performance management. So in an environment where we can't really see each other, how they're doing, how they're feeling, it is really important for everyone to feel safe in order to share what's working, what's not working. With that said, I'm going to go into the next part in a bit more detail, which is about actually personal drive. So this is really about managers understanding what makes individual get out of bed in the morning, what do they value in life, and what are some of the contextual factors that's affecting them. Where do they want to go? The more the managers understand about their people as an individual, the more empathy they can show towards them, which is kind of important in an environment that's like hybrid, where we can't see each other. Also, the more the managers understand the people, the better they will be about motivating and inspiring them and making them feel actually valued as an individual. But to really do that for people, the managers really need to start with themselves first to really understand their 5 Ps. And these are person, which is about how unique, am I? What's my interest, value, and how is my personality different to others? It's about performance. What's my capability? What's my skill? What's my reputation? It's also about possibility. So what are my inspiration, career options, and how they align to organizational goals? It's about place, how the world of work is changing. And it's about plan, which is how can I accelerate my development? It is not just about the role people is doing, it's about holistically looking at the whole situation. So when the managers can start really understand what's going on with themselves, they're more likely to do the same for their team, but also they're more aware of what their own bias is. For example, if I'm manager and I believe career progression is about vertical move, at least I understand that's my preference. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how my team sees that their career progression. So it's important to understand actually we have own preferences and we can be biased in the way that we think about things. The next element is actually about that whole rating of understanding how other people see what's happening. Particularly, you know, we mentioned that working in a hybrid environment, there's a lack of visibility. The use of 360 not only provides that data, but also more rounded picture of how individuals work performance, which actually helps the performance management process to perceive as a more fair one, because not just on one person's opinion. Yeah, we advocate on focusing on the output. I think someone mentioned that in the chat as well, which is about, you know, for example, the number of sales achieved, or could be a number of assignments completed, and less on the input, which is about how much, you know, how many hours you spent on something. So when possible, do focus on that, because that is something that will be perceived as more objective as well. Now, I know the latter, the input is much easier, and to some extent, that's what the managers are used to, but it's about understanding what the outputs could look like and really assess those. That's what we're advocating for. Now, the purpose of 360 is really for the individuals to start thinking about their reputation. Is it in line with, you know, what they expect? If it's not in line with expectation, what needs to happen to align it? Now, in general, we would like managers to focus on strengths as much as possible, but the occasional insight from others can be quite helpful for the individuals to develop. That said, I'm going to hand you back to Colette to talk about strengths.
Sure, thanks, Jenny. And I'll just get you to nudge on the slides rather than...
There you go.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Jenny. So we've already heard just at the start of the presentation around how we see organisations who balance cohesion, agility and belonging being much more successful in this hybrid world. And so enabling people to contribute to the strategic direction by unlocking their maximum potential has to be a core part of this. And so we believe the best way to do this is through strengths. So I'm going to tell you just a very brief story, and it may be one that you've come across before, but it is particularly memorable and makes a very clear point around strength. So forgive me if you've heard it before, but let's just review why we're sharing it. So this is the story about a man called Daley Thompson. Actually, some say possibly one of the greatest decathletes of all time. And when he met his coach in preparation for the 1980s Olympics, and it was Daley's first Olympics, his coach asked him, "What do you want to focus on?" And Daley very quickly responded, "The 1500 meters." That was his weakest event, and running was his most challenging event for him to partake in. And his coach gave, at that time, a rather sort of surprising response, which was to say, "Okay, I understand why you want to focus on that, but actually that's not what we're going to focus on. Instead, we're going to focus all of our effort on the other 9 events that you're already good at. And we're going to focus so much effort that by the time you get to the 1500 meters, which happened to be the final 10th event of the decathlon, you're going to be so far ahead in the points that you've accumulated that actually you will have already secured yourself the gold, and you'll simply need to just get round to the track. You won't need to do any more than that." And actually that's exactly what happened. For any of you that are YouTubers, you'll be able to watch it on YouTube. But by the time that Daley got to the 1500 meters, he had already secured himself a gold medal, and all he needed to do was get round the track. And he comes quite a long way at the back of the pack, but still manages obviously to be a gold Olympic champion. So why did I share that brief story? I suppose we can spend a lot of time and effort focusing on our weaknesses or development areas, and not enough time stretching and strengthening our strengths. And as long as our weaknesses don't necessarily stop us getting around the track, of course, Daley still had to be able to run 1500 meters. He still had to complete the race. We believe that there should be more time in the performance process spent on looking at strengths. And in a hybrid world, enabling organisations now to start to think about how they might regain a competitive edge by powering the organisation forwards through individuals all focused on stretching strengths in line with those strategic priorities is, for us, a really powerful and motivating way to unlock that potential. So we believe all employees have the opportunity to continue to grow and develop with the right support. And in doing so, that will propel the organisation forward to meet its strategic direction. So Jenny, if I can nudge us on, it nicely brings us then to how do we unlock that potential? And of course, we've already mentioned that there is a much greater focus on the skills of the manager to handle the nuances of people management in hybrid. And in this case, it's about having really very well developed skills in coaching. We very much see the manager's role as moving towards creating the conditions for success, and less so about applying a judgment or a performance rating in the traditional performance review sense. So managers, as Jenny has already highlighted, really need to be able to have two-way conversations where managers can listen with curiosity, ask questions, maintain trust, and be empathetic while still supportively challenging, in order to build an understanding of the whole person and really enable them to stretch those strengths. And obviously, as we have described, being able to do that really relies on a trusted connection having already been established. We know that people feel a strong sense of belonging, again, coming back to the sort of factors that make agile organisations successful in hybrid. We know that people feel a strong sense of belonging when they are able to see a connection between their own behaviours and the direction the organisation is travelling. And so being able to set meaningful SMART goals based on strengths that enables people to connect their efforts to the organisational output is obviously still key for us in our model. So we want managers to be able to actually focus on feeding forward. So this is a phrase we're using to really describe the behaviour of a manager to provide insights that enable future success. So we're moving from a feedback model to a feed forward model. And this very much is about identifying the conditions that has led to somebody being successful and feeding those into the individual's awareness such that they can recreate that success in the future by understanding what were some of the factors that led to that success and those strengths being played to. And again, to use an analogy, we see the strengths as the sail in the boat propelling the organisation forward. And of course, we can tolerate some weaknesses if they're above the waterline. And obviously those weaknesses that fall below the waterline have the potential to sink the boat. So we don't necessarily say focusing on strength at all cost. We still need to manage those critical weaknesses that are likely to sink the boat, whilst actually focusing, of course, on primarily strengths to propel us forward. So we've talked a lot about managers' skill, and I just wanted to call out that, of course, we still see a role for individuals in terms of their accountability. So that individuals very much still accountable for their own personal growth, development and performance. But we are acknowledging that in this new world of hybrid, the skills of a manager to be compassionate, to be empathetic, and to be able to handle these conversations where they really do start to understand the individual holistically becomes that much more critical. And so the focus is very much on developing managers and supporting managers to be able to have these much more skilled and nuanced conversations. Jenny, if you could just nudge us on, thank you. So I guess to answer a question that I suppose I posed early into the session, which was, we often are being asked at the moment around how do we reimagine performance management as a process? And I suppose our short answer to that is actually it's less about reimagining the process itself, and instead it's about reimagining the types of conversations that managers are having with individuals to ensure that those conditions are met, that organisations are able to be agile, create a sense of belonging, have a sense of purpose. And we really see that the skills of the manager needs to be around, as Jenny has highlighted, this curiosity, this empathetic style, and stretching strengths in order for those conditions to best be met. So less about reimagining the process and much more about reimagining the types of conversations. Jenny, I'll hand over to you just to do a final.
Thank you, Colette. So, sorry, hopefully this session has given you plenty of food for thought and some ideas to try out on. And as a final summary, here's a position. Let me just go back one slide. If obviously we would love if you can implement everything, right? But we're also quite realistic, to change the whole system is actually quite complex and it is quite hard. But if you can just even change one thing, that goes a long, long way. So, please have a look at the screen. If there's one element that you can change within your workplace, that will give you quite a big impact. Think about how you're going to go forward with that just one thing. If you have any questions about any of them, please do shout out. What we'd love to know, in chat is what resonated most with you today. I think I just saw on chat, it's about talking about actually they love that position of actually let's switch that thinking of from feedback to feed forward. So that's definitely resonating with people. Are there anything else that's resonating with you? If you can share that in the chat, that would be great. I will also ask Iona to share a worksheet with you. That is really for you to take away and further clarify your thinking about what we talked about today. Obviously, we've got about 5 minutes left, so if you have any questions, you can put in the chat. If you have to leave, that's fine. We're happy to give you 5 minutes back. You can use contact@lhh.com to ask us any questions. Claire, are you seeing anything on the chat?
Yeah, lots of acknowledgement of the feed forward, the reimagining of the conversation, thinking about what's measured because data is still good and relevant, but keeping it as simple as possible.
Yeah, perfect. Super. Iona, could you share the worksheet on the chat as well? That would be great.
I have.
Oh,
super. It's
super.
getting lost in all the comments.
So there is somewhere
again.
in the chat. No, don't worry. It's somewhere in the chat just because I can't see it. So super. Right. Well, there you go. I want to just share the sheet again. So thank you so much again for joining today's session. Yeah,
Jenny, we're just being requested to go back one slide just so.
Oh yes.
Or perhaps even sharing the model. That might be. Yeah.
Yes. Let me, in fact, just go back to quite a few slides. Let me just go back to the model itself. Ooh, there you go. So yeah, feel free to take a screenshot of this as well. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining today. Really loved all the sharings that was on the chat as well as in the session itself. So thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to add, Colette?
No, I don't think so. Just a pleasure to hear from. I know we didn't have the chance to hear from everybody, but thanks for getting involved on the chat. That was great. And for those of you that did share, really appreciate that. I would have loved to have had a little bit more time to obviously spend longer, but it's great to have had you all here.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Colette. Thanks, everyone.